The impossible choice. Sharon Johnson had lived a full life. At 70, she had raised children, built a home, and experienced the highs and lows that come with the passage of time. But nothing could have prepared her for the day when her daughter, Emily, came to her with a broken heart. The joy of watching her daughter grow into a successful woman had been one of Sharon's greatest privileges, but the recent months had tested that joy in ways Sharon never thought possible. Emily and her husband, Jacob, had struggled with infertility for years. They'd undergone countless rounds of IVF, each attempt more heartbreaking than the last, and now they were facing the devastating diagnosis. Sharon could still hear Emily's voice trembling with grief as she explained that her uterus was no longer capable of carrying a child. The news had crushed Emily. After all the years of trying, the dream of motherhood had seemed so close, only to be snatched away. Emily's tears had flowed like a river, her body shaking as she whispered, "I'll never be a mother, will I?" That night, Sharon couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, consumed by her daughter's pain and the helplessness she felt. How could she stand by and watch her daughter suffer? How could she not do something, anything, to help? As she sat in the quiet of the night, it hit her, a thought so radical, so unimaginable, that it nearly took her breath away. What if she carried the child for Emily? The idea seemed absurd at first. She was 70, well beyond the age when most women would even consider pregnancy. Her body was older, her health more fragile. But Sharon had always believed that a mother's love knew no limits, and in that moment, she knew what she had to do. The next morning, she sat Emily and Jacob down. The words were difficult to speak, but Sharon was resolute. "I'll carry your child for you," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The reaction was immediate. Emily's eyes widened in shock and disbelief, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to process the enormity of what Sharon was offering. Jacob's face went pale, and he shook his head vehemently. "No, Sharon, you can't. You're too old. It's too dangerous," he argued, his voice filled with concern. Tom, Sharon's husband of 45 years, had been listening from the kitchen. He stormed into the room, his face a mask of fury. "Sharon, have you lost your mind? You could die," he snapped, his voice laced with fear. "Pregnancy is risky at any age, and at 70. The complications could kill you." But Sharon wasn't swayed. She had been in excellent health her entire life, and she knew her body well. "I'm healthy," she said firmly. "Doctors always tell me that I'm in great shape for my age. I can do this." The room was tense, charged with emotions none of them had expected. Jacob, who had always been supportive, couldn't comprehend why Sharon would put herself at such risk. "This isn't just about whether you can, Sharon," he said, his voice cracking. "Pregnancy at your age isn't just hard. It's dangerous. There are risks, Sharon. Stroke, heart failure, organ failure. You could develop gestational diabetes, preeclampsia. This could be life-threatening." Emily, torn between the desire to have a child and the overwhelming guilt of asking her mother to take such a risk, spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "Mom, I can't ask you to do this for me." Sharon, her eyes full of love, reached across the table and took her daughter's hands in hers. "You're not asking," she said gently. "I'm offering. I want to help you. I know the risks, but this is something I can do for you, for our family." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she squeezed her mother's hands tightly, her emotions a mixture of hope and overwhelming fear. Tom, who had been quiet until now, looked at Sharon with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "I won't allow this," he said, his voice low but fierce. Sharon turned to her husband, her expression hardening with resolve. "This isn't your decision to make, Tom. I've made up my mind." For the next few days, the house was filled with tension. Tom barely spoke to Sharon, the weight of his fear evident in his silence. Jacob, ever the pragmatist, continued to research all the ways this could go wrong, presenting Sharon with countless medical articles and statistics that painted a grim picture. Emily swung between overwhelming guilt for asking her mother to take on such a monumental burden and fragile hope, praying that this would be the answer to her years of heartache. Eventually, the family sat down with a high-risk obstetrician. After a battery of tests and discussions, the doctor looked at Sharon with a grave but hopeful expression. "You are in exceptional health for a 70-year-old," the doctor said, "but this will be the oldest recorded surrogate pregnancy we've ever seen. There are risks, many risks, but it is possible." That single phrase, "it is possible," was all Sharon needed to hear. With a heavy heart, Tom finally relented, though his opinion remained clear. "If anything happens to you, I'll never forgive myself," he said softly. Jacob, though still skeptical, couldn't deny the determination in Sharon's eyes. And Emily, overwhelmed with gratitude, cried for an hour, her hands clutching her mother's. "Thank you," she whispered repeatedly, unable to say more. The journey to make this impossible dream a reality began with IVF. Sharon underwent an extensive round of tests to ensure that she was medically fit to carry the pregnancy. The doctors monitored her health carefully, running stress tests, EKGs, and blood work to ensure she was physically capable of withstanding the demands of pregnancy. When the embryos, created from Emily's eggs and Jacob's sperm, were ready, one was carefully transferred into Sharon's womb. The wait was agonizing. Sharon, Emily, and Jacob could barely breathe as they waited for the confirmation. 2 weeks later, the call finally came. Sharon answered the phone, her heart pounding in her chest. "Congratulations, Mrs. Johnson," the nurse said. "You're pregnant." Sharon sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. She had done it. She had made the impossible possible, giving her daughter the chance to become a mother. But she had no idea just how much danger lay ahead. The struggle and sacrifice. Sharon's pregnancy was never going to be easy. Even the doctors, who had cautiously given her the green light to proceed, made it clear from the beginning that her age was an enormous factor. At 70, her body wasn't as resilient as it once was, and every day she carried the baby was a day that tested her limits. But as soon as the positive pregnancy test confirmed that the embryo had successfully implanted, Sharon's resolve only strengthened. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying the future of her family, the dream that Emily and Jacob had fought for so long to achieve. This baby would make everything worth it, no matter the cost. The first weeks were full of hope and apprehension. Sharon experienced the usual early pregnancy symptoms: fatigue, nausea, and mood swings. But unlike other women who might have been able to rest and adjust, Sharon's life continued on as normal. She couldn't afford to slow down. Emily had become her full-time caregiver, making sure Sharon had the right nutrients, vitamins, and everything she needed to stay healthy. Jacob became a constant source of support, helping her with light exercises to keep her blood flowing and her circulation healthy. Despite the discomfort and fatigue, Sharon felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was part of something greater than herself, something that transcended the usual boundaries of age, biology, and even possibility. Every morning as Emily made her nutrient-packed smoothies, Sharon would look at her daughter with love and admiration. Emily, who had once been the one seeking comfort, now became the rock upon which Sharon relied. Tom, however, remained distant. Though he was quietly supportive, the constant worry about his wife's health loomed over him like a dark cloud. He couldn't shake the thought that Sharon was putting herself in grave danger, and no matter how often she reassured him, his fear didn't diminish. "I'll never forgive myself if anything happens to you," he would say when they were alone, his voice heavy with emotion. Sharon would gently squeeze his hand, her eyes full of quiet determination. "I'm doing this because I love you, Tom. I'm doing this because I love Emily. This is my choice." But as the pregnancy progressed, it became clear that Sharon's body wasn't reacting the way anyone had hoped. She had always been a healthy woman, but carrying a child at 70 wasn't something even the healthiest person could do without consequences. At her 8-week scan, The first ultrasound was both hopeful and sobering. There was a heartbeat, faint but strong, filling the room with quiet joy. Sharon's heart swelled with pride as she looked at Emily, whose eyes were filled with tears. But those tears weren't just of joy. They were mixed with a quiet terror that seemed to haunt her whenever she thought about what could happen. Sharon knew that even in the best of circumstances, pregnancy was a challenge. But at her age, it was something much more precarious. Her heart, her kidneys, and her blood pressure were constantly under scrutiny. Every week, she had to undergo additional testing, all while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy in her life. She knew she couldn't give up now. She had already made the impossible decision to carry the baby, and she would do everything she could to protect this fragile life inside her. But as the weeks wore on, things started to change. The second trimester brought more complications than anyone had expected. Sharon began to experience dizziness, shortness of breath, and an increasing sense of weakness. At first, she chalked it up to the normal ups and downs of pregnancy, but when the symptoms worsened, she couldn't ignore them anymore. One evening, as she stood up from the couch, her vision blurred, and the room spun violently. Before she could steady herself, her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor with a heavy thud. Tom was the first to reach her, panic in his eyes as he gently shook her. Sharon, talk to me." Emily and Jacob rushed in, their faces etched with fear. Sharon struggled to sit up, but the room was still spinning. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her voice was shaky and weak. "It's just a little dizzy spell." But the look on her daughter's face told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't just a minor issue. Jacob wasted no time. "We're taking you to the hospital," he insisted. Sharon wanted to protest. She hated hospitals and always felt like a burden when she had to be treated. But the truth was, she had never felt this weak before, and deep down, she knew it was time to face the reality of what she was doing. At the hospital, Dr. Harris wasted no time in running tests. He didn't sugarcoat the situation. Sharon's blood pressure was dangerously high, and the early signs of preeclampsia were evident. The doctor explained the gravity of the situation. Preeclampsia could cause seizures, organ failure, or even death if left unchecked. "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Dr. Harris said gravely. "If this condition worsens, we may have to deliver the baby early, far earlier than we'd like." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she held her mother's hand. "But it's too soon," she said, her voice trembling. "The baby wouldn't survive if he was born now." Dr. Harris nodded, his expression sympathetic. "We will do everything we can to avoid that. But Sharon, you need to take this seriously. If things get worse, we may have no choice but to act quickly." The weight of the doctor's words settled heavily in Sharon's chest. She had promised Emily she would do this. She had made the impossible choice to carry this child. But now it felt like her own body was betraying her. She had never expected this kind of toll, this kind of sacrifice. That night, as she lay in the hospital bed, Emily sat beside her, her eyes red from crying. "Mom," Emily whispered, her voice thick with guilt, "I shouldn't have let you do this. This is my fault." Sharon turned her head, her expression soft but resolute. "No, sweetheart," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with love. "This is my choice. I did this because I love you. I knew the risks, and I accepted them. You have to trust that I can do this." But Emily couldn't stop the tears. She had wanted this so badly, had prayed for a child for so many years, and now her mother was putting her life on the line to make it happen. The guilt was overwhelming. Tom, who had been pacing in the hallway, finally entered the room. His face was pale, his expression tight with emotion. "You need to rest, Sharon," he said, his voice breaking. "We're going to get through this, I promise you." Sharon smiled weakly, feeling the warmth of his presence despite the fear hanging between them. She had always been the strong one in their marriage, but now she found herself relying on the love and support of her family more than ever. She was carrying not just a child, but hope, a hope that had taken root deep within her and refused to let go. The next few weeks were a blur of hospital visits, testing, and constant monitoring. Sharon's health continued to decline, and the risks became more apparent with each passing day. Yet despite it all, she never gave up. She kept pushing forward, believing that she could do this, that she could see this through. She was a mother, after all, and a mother would do anything for her child. But as Sharon's body continued to struggle, the question remained, could she keep going? Could she endure the sacrifices needed to bring this child into the world? One thing was certain, Sharon would fight, no matter the cost. Because in the end, love was the greatest sacrifice of all. A family on the edge. The days in the hospital felt like a blur of tests, blood pressure readings, and anxious waiting. Sharon's body was showing signs of wear, but her determination to see this through never wavered. Every day, she fought through the exhaustion, the dizzy spells, and the heavy weight of preeclampsia hanging over her. Emily and Jacob did everything they could to help. Emily's face, often streaked with tears, was a constant presence by her side, offering love and support in ways that spoke volumes about the bond between mother and daughter. Jacob, ever the pragmatist, kept pushing forward, researching ways to help Sharon, and ensuring she followed every piece of medical advice. But despite their tireless efforts, the overwhelming reality was clear. Sharon's body was reaching its limits, and each passing day was a gamble. At 24 weeks, Sharon's condition began to deteriorate further. The doctors had warned that preeclampsia could escalate quickly, and it had. Sharon's blood pressure remained dangerously high despite all efforts to stabilize it. She could feel the pressure on her body building as her feet began to swell, and she felt an overwhelming fatigue that seemed to sink deeper into her bones. At first, it was manageable, but now it felt almost insurmountable. The thought of giving up had never crossed her mind. She had come too far for that. But there were moments when the physical toll was too much to ignore, and the strain of carrying a child at her age became painfully real. One morning, as Sharon tried to sit up from the bed, her vision blurred. The room around her spun violently, and before she could steady herself, she collapsed, her body crumpling to the floor with a soft thud. Emily, who had been sitting nearby, jumped to her feet, her heart racing. "Mom!" she cried, rushing to her side. She helped Sharon back onto the bed, her hands shaking as she checked her mother's pulse. Sharon groaned, trying to sit up, but her breath came in shallow gasps. "Mom, we need to get you to the hospital," Emily said urgently. But Sharon, despite the dizziness clouding her mind, stubbornly shook her head. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her voice was strained. "Just a little dizzy." But Emily wasn't convinced. She had seen this before, in the earlier days of the pregnancy when Sharon had tried to downplay her discomfort. This wasn't normal. "No, we're going now," Emily insisted, her voice trembling. Minutes later, Sharon found herself back in the familiar setting of the emergency room. The sterile smell of the hospital was oddly comforting, a strange sense of security amid the chaos of her health problems. Dr. Harris immediately took charge. Tests were run, blood work sent for analysis, and within what felt like moments, the news wasn't good. Sharon's preeclampsia had worsened, and her kidneys were beginning to show signs of strain. Dr. Harris looked at Sharon and her family with a grim expression. "You're going to need to take it easy," he said. "Bed rest, strict monitoring, and we may have to consider delivering the baby earlier than planned." Emily's heart sank. "But it's too soon. He's not ready to be born." Dr. Harris nodded, his expression softening. "I know, but we're approaching a critical point. If this condition worsens, we may have to act quickly to save both Sharon and the baby. We'll do everything we can to keep him safe, but we have to prepare for the worst." Sharon's pulse quickened as she processed the doctor's words. This wasn't just about the baby anymore. It was about her own life hanging in the balance. But she knew, deep down, there was no turning back. She had made this commitment, and she would see it through. Emily's voice, thick with emotion, broke the silence. "Mom, please, you have to be careful. I can't lose you." Sharon reached out to her daughter, taking her hand in hers. "Sweetheart, you won't lose me. I'm doing this because I love you, because I love this baby. I knew the risks, and I accepted them." She forced a smile, despite the overwhelming pressure on her body. "But I need you to trust me. I'll be okay." The doctor agreed to put Sharon on strict bed rest, monitoring her condition closely. Despite everything, Sharon's resolve didn't falter. Emily and Jacob made sure that she stayed on track with the doctor's orders, hovering protectively over her, but the weight of the situation was taking a toll on them all. In the following days, Sharon's health continued to decline, and the pressure was mounting. Her body was no longer able to handle the demands of carrying a baby, and yet she was determined not to back down. Each day felt like a battle, but there was still hope. Hope that the baby would make it. Hope that her own body would hold up long enough to bring this child into the world. It wasn't just about Emily's dream of motherhood anymore. It was about everything Sharon had sacrificed, about the love that had brought them to this point. At 28 weeks, the doctors called a family meeting to discuss Sharon's condition. They had tried every possible treatment to stabilize her blood pressure, but nothing seemed to work. "The risks are growing," Dr. Harris said, his tone somber. "We need to prepare for the possibility of an early delivery. We may have to choose between saving Sharon or saving the baby." Emily's face paled, her hands trembling. "No, we can't make that decision. We can't choose." Tom, who had been unusually quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "You save Sharon," he said, his voice strong but edged with fear. "She's my wife. I can't lose her." Sharon's heart ached at his words. "Tom," she whispered, "don't think like that. I'm not ready to go yet. I'm not ready to leave any of you." But the situation was growing more desperate. Despite all efforts, Sharon's health continued to deteriorate. Her kidneys were beginning to fail, and she could barely stay awake for more than a few hours at a time. The doctors had warned that she could fall into a coma if her condition worsened. Emily could no longer ignore the fear in her mother's eyes. The future felt like it was slipping away from her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The family had become a shadow of itself. Emily spent sleepless nights by her mother's side, praying for some miracle. Jacob, despite his usually practical nature, had become a mess of nerves, constantly watching Sharon's vitals, obsessing over every tiny fluctuation. And Tom, always the protector, always the strong one, was a shell of the man he used to be. Sharon had carried the weight of their family for so long, but now, in her weakened state, it was clear that everyone around her was carrying a piece of her burden. One quiet evening, as Sharon lay in her hospital bed, her eyes closed, but her breathing labored, Emily sat next to her, holding her hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't leave me. I need you. I can't do this without you." Sharon's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled weakly. "You don't have to do this alone, sweetheart," she whispered back. "I'm always with you, no matter what happens." Sharon had defied the odds just by being here, just by still fighting. But as she stared at her daughter, the fear in her heart mixed with a deep, profound love. There was no choice for her. She had made it. She would hold on, no matter what it took, because in that moment, there was nothing more important than her family. The journey wasn't over yet, and the hardest moments were still to come, but Sharon's love for Emily, for the baby she was carrying, would not let her give up. Even in the face of uncertainty, even as her body continued to fail her, her spirit was as strong as ever. A miracle's promise. The hospital had become a second home to Sharon and her family. Day after day, they watched as Sharon's health continued to decline. Despite the best efforts of the doctors, the toll of carrying a child at her age was becoming unbearable. Sharon's body, though strong in many ways, could only fight for so long. Every moment felt like a race against time, and every decision weighed heavier than the last. By the time Sharon reached 30 weeks, the tension was suffocating. Her heart rate had become erratic, her kidneys were beginning to shut down, and her blood pressure remained dangerously high. Every time the nurses checked her vitals, it seemed like the next scan would reveal something worse. Her body was tired, worn thin by the strain of carrying a child when it was never meant to. That night, Emily stood by her mother's bedside, holding her hand tightly. The quiet beep of the monitor was the only sound in the room, a constant reminder that every moment counted. Sharon's face, though pale and weakened, still held the same unwavering strength it had for as long as Emily could remember. "Mom, please," Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please fight. We can't lose you. You've already given so much. Please." Sharon's eyes fluttered open, her gaze soft but steady. She squeezed Emily's hand, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart, I'm not ready to go. Not yet." She took a slow, labored breath. "I made a promise to you, and I intend to keep it. I'll fight as long as I can." In that moment, Emily felt the weight of her mother's words settle in her heart. It wasn't just a promise to her. It was a promise to the little boy growing inside Sharon, the child that had brought them to this point, that had made Sharon give everything she had. Emily didn't know how much longer her mother could hold on, but one thing was clear: Sharon would never give up. That night, everything changed. The hospital room was quiet, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. Sharon's breathing became shallow, and Emily, sitting beside her, felt the tension in the air. Then, suddenly, Sharon's chest heaved, and her heart rate spiked. The monitors began to beep urgently, a loud, sharp sound that cut through the silence like a knife. Emily's heart stopped as she reached for her mother's hand. "Mom," she called, her voice rising in panic. Sharon's body went rigid, and then she collapsed, her breath becoming erratic. "No," Emily screamed, tears welling in her eyes as she desperately tried to rouse her mother. The medical team rushed in, pushing Emily aside as they worked frantically to stabilize Sharon's vitals. The room was filled with frantic voices and beeping monitors, but all Emily could do was watch, her heart racing in her chest. As the doctors worked, time seemed to stretch infinitely. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, in the midst of the chaos, Emily heard something she would never forget. A tiny, faint cry. It was coming from the incubator. Her eyes snapped to the source of the sound. The tiny baby, the child that had been fighting for its life as much as Sharon had finally arrived. Sharon's battle had been nothing short of heroic, but now the fight was no longer just hers to win. The baby she had carried so selflessly was here, and Emily, her heart full of a new kind of love, knew that her mother had made it all worth it. Dr. Harris turned to Emily with a relieved smile. "It's a boy," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "Your son, he's here." Emily collapsed into her chair, tears flowing freely as a wave of emotion crashed over her. "He's here," she whispered, her voice full of disbelief and wonder. "He's really here." As the medical team continued to care for Sharon, Emily made her way to the incubator, her eyes falling on the tiny baby who had made it through against all odds. The baby was small, fragile, but alive. The doctor had said that he was still in critical condition, but he had made it through the first hurdle. Emily touched the glass gently, her fingers brushing against the small, delicate hand that was reaching out as if it knew its mother was near. "Sharon," she whispered softly, her voice full of reverence and gratitude. "We did it. We really did it." For a moment, everything in the room seemed to still. Emily stood there, her hand pressed against the incubator, watching as her son, her miracle, took each small breath. Sharon had fought for this moment. She had given everything, and now, Emily was holding her son in her heart, knowing that her mother's strength, her love, would forever be a part of this little boy's story. Sharon's health was still uncertain. The doctors had managed to stabilize her, but they were cautious about the future. Yet, in that moment, Emily knew there was hope, hope that her mother had given everything for. Sharon had defied every expectation, pushing past her physical limits, and now she had given Emily the greatest gift of all. As the hours passed, Sharon's condition remained fragile, but Emily never left her side. She talked to her, holding her hand, just as she had done for her mother when the journey had begun. Emily whispered stories of her son, of how his tiny fingers had grasped her hand, how he had fought to live. "Mom, he's fighting, and I'm going to fight for him, just like you fought for me." It wasn't long before Sharon's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile spreading across her face. "He's here?" she asked, her voice hoarse but filled with pride. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice full of joy and gratitude. "He's here, Mom, and he's going to make it, just like you." Sharon's gaze softened as she looked at her daughter, the overwhelming love in her eyes speaking volumes. "I knew you could do it, sweetheart," she whispered. "I knew you'd be a wonderful mother." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she kissed her mother's forehead, whispering, "You're my hero, Mom. You always have been." The battle wasn't over yet. Sharon's health was still in jeopardy, and the baby was still fragile. But in that room, there was an undeniable sense of hope, a hope that Sharon had nurtured through her love, her sacrifices, and her unrelenting spirit. No matter what happened next, one thing was certain: they had made it through the storm together, as a family. In the end, it wasn't just the baby who had fought for life. It was Sharon, too. And in the quiet moments, when Emily looked at her son, she knew the legacy of love and courage her mother had passed down would live on forever. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.